Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for all participants who join in this webinar from all around the world. I'm Rahmi Artanti from Transnational Institute, and I'll introduce the webinar and explain some technical information on Zoom tool later. So welcome to our webinar on data colonizations hinders just transitions, organized by Asia-Europe People's Forum, together with Focus on the Global South, Seattle to Brussels Network, Transnational Institute, Global Justice Now UK, IT for Change India, Indonesia for Global Justice, Sahita Institute, Public Services International, Asia Pacific, Third World Network, and Our World is Not for Sale. This activity is part of APF Week of Solidarity with Just Transitions. And the main objective of the webinar is to raise the awareness of social movements, especially at the grassroots level, and media or journalists on the fundamental problems of data monopoly by the big techs and hinders the realizations of climate justice and just transitions, especially in the agricultural and energy sectors. Besides that, the webinar will also highlight the current state of play of digital rules and cross-border data flow in the G20 meeting under the presidency of Indonesia and other digital trade negotiations at the WTO and free trade agreements in the region. Perhaps you can unmute that first. Okay. Sorry. So the discussions will be moderated by Joseph Puruganan from Focus on the Global South. And before we start the discussions, please rename your ID with name, organizations, and country. And then the host has the right to remove automatically unidentified participants or annoying participants. The webinar will be recorded and made available on the APF website later. So to give an initial view on data colonizations, we will be showing a short video produced by Transnational Institute and Indonesia for Global Justice. So enjoy watching the video, and later we can have deeper discussions with the speakers. Okay. I'll try to connect.
Digital colonialism. What is digital colonialism? How is digital colonialism changing our world? Every time we connect to the internet, we generate data. This data becomes the raw material for digital colonialism's production processes. So, what is that product of digital colonialism? The product is algorithm predictions about how we behave, based on the sweeping data big tech companies collect. The algorithm makes decisions about our lives based on all the information we spend. It has the power to predict and determine our behavior. Some authors call this the behavioral surplus. This product so valuable.
We've done a lot with lots of aloe vera, with that silver thing.
What predictions about our behavior as consumers? Our behavior as citizens is interesting for governments and others to scrutinize. In a new phase of cyber capitalism, our behavior as workers enables new levels of workplace surveillance. Who is selling these products? Who is processing this information? And who is doing the programming? There are the big tech companies like Google, Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft. There are two interrelated levers that make these companies so valuable: data and platforms. How did the big tech companies monopolize the digitalization of the economy? Big tech companies become leaders in global digital value chains. Their profits depend on sustaining their power to extract data. They use their significant power to fight for rules that enable them to keep control. They need rules to entrench a business model that allows them to be the owners of cyber capital, to guarantee their monopoly over that behavioral surplus in perpetuity. and enable them to eliminate competitors and establish themselves as the only future technological model. How do these rules work? The World Trade Organization regulates some free trade agreements, including digital chapters that lay out rules, which give all the rights to large transnational big tech companies, and restrict the ability of states to regulate, to redistribute profits, to improve public services, or to take forward local technological development strategies. Which digital trade rules limit state sovereignty? First, clauses that hinder digital industrialization in Global South countries, such as the free flow of cross-border data transfer, prohibitions on data localization, prohibitions on local data processing, non-disclosure of source codes of software and related algorithms, elimination of customs duties on digital products and electronic transmissions, and electronic public procurement. Second, clauses that restrict states' control of corporate activities, such as prior authorization, non-discrimination against digital products, electronic authentication and signatures, surveillance, and liability of intermediary service providers. And third, clauses that violate citizens' rights, such as free flow of data with no protection of personal data and online consumer protection, including the weakness of the rule to prevent unsolicited electronic marketing communications. What will be the impact of these rules? The impact of these rules. First, countries in the Global South will be harmed by brutal competition that will hamper the development of incipient local technologies. Second, they limit the ability of states to control companies operating online, shaping digital markets, and giving the corporations rights while relieving them of duties. Third, the rules can remove protections for citizens and consumers, especially in the Global South, by imposing requirements without transferring the resources needed to meet them. So we need a stronger government in setting regulations to protect personal data from the profits of big tech companies, especially agreements that open up more freedom for them. So, if you need more information about digital colonialism, you can visit our website. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I will let Joseph to lead the discussions. Please, Joseph.
Thank you, Rakmi. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us in this webinar, Data Colonization, Hinders a Just Transition. My name is Joseph Puruganan from Focus on the Global South. We adopted an intriguing title for our discussion, as the video just showed as well, Data Colonization. What is it about data that makes it such an important issue today? And why and by whom is it being colonized? It's quite fitting that we are organizing this webinar in the immediate aftermath of Indonesia's hosting of the G20 summit, where data was a key point of the discussions among the most powerful states. And agreements were forged around the agenda of connectivity and post-COVID recovery, digital skill and digital literacy, and cross-border data free flow with trust. But the word colonization also brings back another event in Indonesia's history and its contribution to the building of third world unity, or more particularly, Afro-Asian unity, the Bandung Conference, which was the first international conference of African and Asian states aimed at building Afro-Asian unity and cooperation against colonialism and neo-colonialism. I wonder if we as movements can also reflect on our anti-colonial struggles in the past to forge and strengthen people's resistance to digital or data colonization. Data, as the video said, is a key resource in digital society and economy. But who controls data? Key question. Who makes decisions on the utilization of data, and who secures the benefits from the use of this data? Who moves the agenda and for increased digitalization, and how is it impacting many aspects of people's lives and the fulfillment of rights, for example? What is the state of regulation? Who is shaping the digital governance regime? A lot of questions to answer and issues to unpack. We have the best people to help unpack these issues this afternoon. We have invited 4 speakers who will discuss a particular aspect or dimension of data colonization. We will give each speaker around 15 minutes for their intervention. So let's get to the discussion. Our first speaker is Parminder Jeet Singh. Parminder is the Executive Director of IT for Change, an India-based NGO working on equity and social justice in a digital society. He has been a special advisor to the chair of the UN Internet Governance Forum and to the UN Global Alliance on ICTs for Development. Parminder will explain the fundamental problem of data monopoly and cross-border data flows. Parminder, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Joseph. Let me start by, referring to what Joseph was describing about the rise of third world unity and the Bandung conference and how much we look forward to now a digital Bandung is largely what I would go towards as I end my 15 minutes of talk. We really need that some kind of a third worldism of digital world as well. And just today, there was a news report it's from a South African newspaper, Business Life, which talks about a warning by the Singapore PM that the US decision to curb supply of microchips to Chinese companies would have widespread consequences and greater decoupling between the top 2 economies, which will create a less stable world. It's just last year, the chief of IMF, a chief of IMF is not a radical person, doesn't make radical statements, but she said that we are going towards a digital Berlin Wall. So this is the kind of future we face, and the threats are real. And sometimes I feel they're worse than the problems which the industrial age presented about polarization of the world, war, and inequality. I would now try to go down to the basics first and try to talk quickly about what is a digital economy, and from there, what does digital or data colonization mean? And depending on the time left, I would try to talk what has begun to happen in some circles about it, and also perhaps what can be done by civil society groups and progressive forces. So first of all, the big problem is that digital economy is not well understood at all. I'm sorry, it looks too boastful to say that kind of a thing. But there's a good reason, because the people who control the narrative do not want it to be understood for what it is. They want to make it look like it is about the applications. You see some things which you could never do, you are able to do. They just want you to look at the peripheries of what becomes possible through those applications and platforms, which everybody knows now because we use them. We know Uber, we know Amazon, we know all those applications, health applications, sports applications, education applications, and they just want you to see what is happening, what's good. And therefore, it's all well and good. More developing countries get those applications and platforms. Doesn't matter who provides them. It's good for all of you. But nobody wants to go at the core of what is a digital economy. Now, I tried to take the example of what industrial economy was. What happened in the late 17th century, which started a whole revolution, which was not just a technical shift, but not just an economic shift, but a social, cultural, and political shift. If you really look at it, what happened as the start of the Industrial Revolution was the invention of machine. Machine as a construct or an artifact, where first time the physical power, which earlier used to be in human beings or animals, that's how everything got worked. That power was first time embedded or disembodied from animal to and human beings into a machine. So machine was able to do things like otherwise animals and human beings did. So physical power was embodied into a machine, and a whole 300 years of industrial age is what we saw. quickly fast forward. What is happening today is, for first time, systemic intelligence has been disembodied from human beings into machines. Not just the intelligence we know in a computer, which is kind of a recorded or a reflected intelligence, but a somewhat autonomous systemic intelligence. And machines are able to run whole sectors, activities, and actors almost autonomously. Now, when you really look at Amazon and Uber, and the next question I would like to ask you, if people want to know what company is Uber or what company is Amazon, and people are a little confused. They say they are platforms. Platform doesn't really mean much, or they say it's a transport company. But the problem is that Uber doesn't own any cars. No commuter has ever seen Uber. How does a transport company, which is invisible, right? Same is with Amazon. So what companies these are is not very clear. So what has actually happened, and I'm trying to connect it to what I was earlier saying, there are autonomous systems which are at once able to orchestrate the actors and activity in a whole transportation sector. They're able to tell the driver, go left, we'll find a commuter there. They're going to be able to tell the commuter that you have to just wait 5.5 minutes and a car will pick up. When the cars move, they are able to tell you, don't take this route, take that route. They are able to predict that in the evening, the traffic would be higher in this area and lower in this area. They can predict that so many drivers are now asleep and they'll get up around that time and there would be more availability. So it's like almost a brain which is functioning, and nobody is actually taking those decisions. Now, human beings are largely out. Of course, management decisions and incentives to the systems are fed by human beings. But once the incentives are fed, it's an autonomous system which is getting intelligent. It's very intelligent. It's almost like a human brain who then is orchestrating a whole sector. Really look at it, Amazon is simply similar kind of a brain which is orchestrating logistic providers, traders, manufacturers, suppliers, payment providers in one go, like a brain does to the body. They're able to control and orchestrate everything. So that's what these organizations are. The problem is nobody even names these organizations as what IT for Change calls them intelligence corporations. Like there were industrial corporations doing all kind of physical activities. These corporations' main asset is that they own the intelligence of a sector. I'm very sure you've never heard these kind of lines before, which is itself intriguing, that why wouldn't somebody recognize the main asset of a company, which is intelligence? And that also makes you think, oh, we have heard about data being the most valuable asset, but why this guy is talking about intelligence? No, data is not itself an asset. What do you do with data? I can give you truckloads of data and you're not going to be able to do anything about it. Data is a raw material because it provides intelligence about the subjects of data. And therefore, the real asset is intelligence. And the corporations which are at the top of the value chain today are those corporations which own the intelligence of the sector, and they supersede the intellectual property owning organizations which were till a few years back at the top of the global value chains. Now, I know I have said very, very big things, but that's fundamentally what is happening. And now try to say what is data colonization after describing what data economy is. Now, if again go to the industrial age analogy, the industrial colonization consisted of a chain of economic activities where the raw material was produced in developing countries. They colonized developing countries to force them to produce raw material for the industries in the West or industrialized countries, from where then the finished products came, and these sectors were monetized precisely to be able to sell their finished products. And this was a dependency which was created, and that dependency has, we have seen, has created such huge devastation, which I need not even start talking about. Now, again, fast forward 300 years, the new chain is that the data is produced in developing countries. It's sucked immediately into platforms which are owned by developed countries, and some, I mean, not even developed countries, just US, and some in China. You'll be surprised to know, it's a 2-year-old statistics, and things may have gone worse, of UNCTAD, that 90% ownership of top 70 platforms, not 5, not 10, not 15, 70 platforms, 90% of ownership is divided between US and China. And this kind of concentration of wealth never happened ever in all the ages till now, not at the worst time of industrial colonization as well. Now, what happens is, therefore, the data flows to these platforms, And this data then gets transformed, as I said, into intelligence. This intelligence resides inside servers and companies' controls of US and some in China, from where then it is exercised over the physical activity in a country. So in India, we would have our own logistic drivers running on mobiles, our own SMEs, our own traders, our own some payment people, etc. These are all actors and activities. The physical things are here, but the brain is in the US. So there is the brain, and this is the physical thing, and this is the new relationship. And you can understand that once we keep on getting dependent on what is called outsourced intelligence, that dependency is acute. Now I'm again going to take an industrial age example. Let's say, we were importing Mercedes cars, and suddenly the Mercedes cars are not available for some reason. We can still copy a Mercedes car and try to make indigenous cars. They have been made, they won't be that good, but still you will have cars that will move. You can replace a foreign dependency by some local indigenous productions. But what happens with the intelligence is that that's not so easily replaceable. The data over many years about you, about your town, about your local activity, traders, manufacturers, has been granularly captured in some brain which is in the US. That is not replaceable. And when somebody says, oh, I want to go to cut those channels of intelligence to you, you are there literally like a headless chicken, running around like a headless chicken because your intelligence is outside. In time, and very soon, what do you need in a kitchen? How do you organize your salon visits? How often a service provider like a gardener or plumber comes to your house? What are your preferences? What you buy, what you don't buy, how you travel? All those intelligences are held in a brain outside, and your life is so much dependent on that. You right now only know about Facebook and Google, but you are really looking at physical activities, all sectors of your physical activities. Your dependence is so high that if somebody says, I'm going to cut those channels, you say, you take away my political freedom, you take anything, but I need those drips of intelligence coming because I can't survive without it. And from my example, it would have been clear that while industrial age dependencies were bad enough, they are nothing in comparison to intelligence-based and data-based dependencies which are being created. Now, if this is the problem, and this is what is called data and digital colonization, I'll spend the next 3.5 minutes that I've got to try to say what should be done. And let me quickly talk about what is being done. Now, you'll be surprised, and perhaps not so surprised, that some of the biggest work to avoid digital colonization is being done in Europe. Because this is the first time that Europe is actually no better than, say, India or Indonesia, the bigger digital economies in the South. They're as dependent. And if you really are following news in this area, you will very often hear the word digital sovereignty being spoken in Europe. Almost every week, there is a leader who calls for digital and data sovereignty. Now, of course, Europeans would not like to use the word colonization, which is very obvious why they wouldn't. And therefore, they use the word digital sovereignty and data sovereignty. And you can understand that people talk about sovereignty only when there is a fear of losing it. That's when people talk about virtues, when they are probably being accused of having lost it. So there's a lot of talk of data and digital sovereignty, which is basically nothing other than talk about digital and data colonization, which is precisely we are talking about. So Europe is one which is most worried. So Europe is bringing a barrage of laws, but still it is shy of directly naming the problem and therefore going to what should be digital industrial policies, which directly address the problem of data and digital corporation by giving preference to its own industry, insulating industries, helping in fact industries, which is an old industrial policy framework. They are only half going there. Sometimes they mention it and sometimes they say, no, we are free market, because they are not able to make up that should we be the US or should we stand out. They don't like to be standing in the queue with the developing countries. So that schizophrenia is still what largely rents their mind, but there are a lot of initiatives today in Europe which addresses data colonization. They have a Digital Markets Act, which gives rights to traders on Amazon platform to the data which the Amazon platform collects about them and about their customers. It has a Data Act which gives rights to SME owners of machinery whose data may be collected by an application and they can get their data back. They have a Data Governance Act, which allows data collaboratives to be developed. Then they have a project called GRAI, which is an effort, and the objectives of that project itself talks about data sovereignty and digital sovereignty, where they want to develop European data spaces or data infrastructures. Their data strategy also is based on developing their own data infrastructures and data strategies. So one of the biggest things we need to do to meet address the power of foreign platforms is to have data infrastructures as public infrastructures. I have no time to go into the details of what those infrastructures would be, but that's quite a well-developed area nowadays. EU is doing a lot of work. India has a committee report of non-personal data framework, of which I was a member, which also has come up with mandatory sharing of data by platforms of important data, which is then put in a data infrastructure. And like in the industrial age, roads, ports, bridges, they were common to everybody. Everybody could use them equally. And certain kind of data then can be used by everybody equally within the country, not outside, because then it will become another form of data colonization. But within the country, data infrastructures are developed so that, and the platforms who collect data are mandated to share that data into that data platform, and therefore local industry can be developed. And therefore we can start a digital industrial policy, which would have many, many other concepts, local cloud computing and other things. But these are the basics of what is happening and what needs to be done. I'll stop here because I'm just about 20 seconds more than 15 minutes. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Parminder, for giving us that broad overview. I think the analogy of the industrial economy and the digital economy is quite useful. Understanding from the economic activities, from the use of raw materials, and how data has become that raw material, how that raw material is processed to produce products, digital products, and the problems associated with that kind of a system that has developed, the dependencies, as you pointed out. So from that, so thank you very much for that. We can go back to some of the solutions or the responses that we need to push later on in our discussion. But from that broad overview, let's go now to a bit more specific, and look at how these issues that Parminder have raised impacts the agriculture sector. Our next speaker is someone that I've worked with for many years, Afsar Jafri from GRAI. GRAI is an international NGO that supports small farmers and social movements in their struggles for community-controlled and biodiverse food systems. Afsar has been working on agriculture issues for decades and has written extensively on the ill effects of green revolution, international trade, GMOs, IPRs, and patents, and about agroecology and food sovereignty. Afsar will help unpack how big tech monopolizes data in the agriculture sector. Afsar, you have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Joseph, and thanks to all the organizers and the APF of the, for giving me this opportunity to speak on this issue. And I'm very happy to share the panel with Parminder, Jane, and Sofia. As Joseph has already introduced me, my name is Afsar Jafri, and I work with GRAI, and currently I'm based in New Delhi. So very good afternoon to all of you. And I hope my presentation is shown here. Remy?
You can share the screen.
Oh, okay, hold on.
I can also help you to share the screen.
Oh, I thought you could do it. That's why I sent it to you. Yeah. Okay, no problem.
Okay.
Because I'm not very familiar with this. Okay, yeah, it's there. Yeah. So yeah. Now As Joseph has said, I'm going to basically look at how the data, big data monopolization in the agriculture sector. And, just to look at the World Economic Forum, because they have called this age as the fourth industrial revolution, or they have also named it as Industry 4.0. And one of the important feature, as Parminder has also pointed out, of this age is the rapid expansion of digitalization in every spheres of our life. During the pandemic, we have all witnessed how digitalization became part and parcel of our daily affairs, whether we lived in rural or in urban areas. And there is so much penetration of digital technology in social, political, economic situation of our society that many people call this as digital colonization. In food and agriculture, the Industry 4.0 is termed as Agriculture 4.0. And interchangeably, it is also called as smart farming and digital agriculture changes. And digital agriculture, which is brought about by digital infrastructure and new technologies. In this agriculture system, the whole food supply chain is getting increasingly digitalized or turned into digital information using data-related technologies such as precision agriculture, automatic sensory tracking devices, Internet of Things, mobile and cloud technologies, artificial intelligence, or blockchain. Therefore, the data is the core of the digital agriculture system. And I'll just quote from OECD report, which is on the Food and Agriculture and Fisheries paper 122 of 2019, which basically says that agriculture sector is both an important consumer and supplier of data. Farm data are particularly important to facilitate global value chain integration. So as per this report, farmers and farming are the new market. They are not only consumer, but they also supplier of data which feed the big tech companies. But this report also cautions that essential information like soil conditions, climate, and water quality that should be publicly accessible to farmers as it is necessary for agriculture production can easily be extracted, stored, privatized, and monopolized by a handful of agribusiness and digital companies. Next slide, please. And this is no longer a threat. It is actually happening. And in this presentation, I'll try to unpack this phenomena and how the data is being used to monopolize agriculture system in the developing world where farmers and farming are already in big distress. The implementation of digital technologies in agriculture, such as artificial intelligence, drones, and e-commerce are growing at lightning speed. Agribusiness corporations are teaming up with digital technology companies and creating their own digital arms to create products and services targeting food supply chain. Today, there is an unprecedented level of investment in the digital information platforms connected to their cloud services from digital and ICT, information and communication technologies companies that traditionally have not worked in agriculture sector. And these are the big platform companies like Microsoft, Apple, Google, Facebook. Now, GRAI research shows that in 2020, investment in agri-tech has been more than tripled to $31 billion from $9 billion in 2016. So this, you can imagine the importance of these big companies, how much data they are in fact sitting on. As vertical and horizontal integration happens along the food supply chain, corporations see the potential of gathering agriculture data, enabled by digital technologies to monopolize the supply chain and maximize their profit. By using drones, artificial intelligence, sensoring devices, these global technology companies, also known as big tech, are able to harvest real-time farmers' data and analyze the conditions of their soils and water, the growth of their crops and situations with pests and diseases, and the looming weather and climatic changes. For example, Microsoft has developed a digital platform called Azure FarmBeats that operates through the company massive global cloud technology called Azure. The platform is being designed to provide farmers with real-time data and analysis on conditions of their soils and water, the growth of their crops, the situation with pests and diseases, and the looming weather and climatic changes they may face. The value of this information and advice depends on the volume and quality of data that Microsoft can harvest and analyze with algorithms. This is why Microsoft has partnered with leading companies developing farm drones and sensoring devices, as well as with those companies developing technologies that can receive and act upon the information transmitted from FarmBeats. The high-tech tractors, pesticide spraying drones, and other machines hooked up to Azure cloud. Next slide, please. In September 2020, Microsoft and Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, which is GRAI, which is also one of the big programs by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they formalized a partnership to help Microsoft expand its Azure FarmBeats platform across Africa and deepen their joint effort to deploy Microsoft chatbot app called KuzaBot. This app provides small farmers with advice via WhatsApp and SMS, including information on what inputs to use and which companies to buy from. In India, we have seen the similar exercise. Microsoft signed an MOU with Union Agriculture Ministry in April 2021 to set up AgriStack, which is a unified farmer services interface to provide Indian farmers end-to-end services across the agriculture food value chain. As per this MOU, Microsoft could possibly get access to a database of 50 million farmers and their land records maintained by the government under different programs, with the possibility of more data being added later. Data collected could include personal details, for example, family and bank details, profile of land held, the measurement of the land, the fertility of the soil, the production details, the sowing details, crop quality, and the financial details. For example, how much loan the farmer had, what kind of the credit rating the farmers maintain. All these details will go to Microsoft. Experts fear that the huge amount of data that this project is going to collect can lead to massive exploitation of farmers using their own data against them, along with erosion of their privacy. Next slide, please. The big tech teams up with giant agribusiness companies like Bayer, Corteva, which is a merger after merger of Dow and DuPont. Corteva got formed. Syngenta Group and ChemChina, which is the same. Syngenta was bought over by ChemChina, and BASF, to provide advice to farmers on seeds, pesticides, and fertilizer. The last few years have seen an explosion of mobile apps developed by these pesticide and fertilizer companies to offer to farmers to help them decide what crops to plant, how much pesticide to spray, how much fertilizer to use, when to harvest, among other things. And I can call this as an invisible extension services provided by this company, because each country, each agriculture department, in India also there used to be a extension services. But these kind of extension service which these companies are providing is invisible. The farmer doesn't know from where the so-called help or advice is coming. So almost all prominent agribusiness players have collaborated with global technology companies to create apps that now cover millions of hectares of farms. In return for the advice offered by these apps, farmers supply agribusinesses with a steady flow of data on soil and weather conditions, the prevalence of pests, crop yields, etc. In reality, the farmers become their customer and get dependent on their advice, replacing the public agriculture extension services. For example, Bayer Field View, which is its digital platform and farming platform, tracks 87.5 billion data points from 180 million acres of farmland in 23 countries and funnel it into the cloud server of Microsoft and Amazon. In fact, if you want to go into more details of what is the different, how much these big corporations control, you can look at ETC latest report called Food Barons 2022. Next slide, please. Now, like Microsoft, in BSF also has its own app. It's called Xervio, which identify weeds, diseases, insects in farms, field, and predicts when they would become a problem. To run this app, these apps by Microsoft or by Bayer and BASF, they use cloud computing platforms of Amazon Web Services, one of the biggest big tech company that control the world's cloud service and is ahead of Microsoft, Google, and Alibaba. In 2020, 4 major platforms, these are the Alibaba, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft alone, accounted for 67% of revenue accruing from global cloud infrastructure services. Next slide, please. Similarly, Yara, which is one of the largest fertilizer company in the world, offers a whole set of digital tools to assess farmers' fertilizer needs, such as Yarelrix, a tool for precision farming that allows farmer to measure crop nitrogen requirements using their smartphones. Another similar firm which is owned by Yara is called @Farm, which allows farmer to analyze their field with satellite images and selectively apply fertilizer. Many leading food and beverages processors companies already control digital data for raw materials sourcing, processing, marketing, and delivery. Similarly, Amazon, which is also one of the big delivery corporation, uses its big data to track consumer shopping habits and preferences. John Dairy, which is one of the world's largest farm machinery company, they employs more software engineer than the mechanical engineer. Not only limited to input and equipment companies, the Microsoft and Amazon have also entered the GSaaS, which is basically the ground station as a service market, enabling satellite operators to communicate and control their satellite and process the data with their artificial intelligence services. In October 2020, Microsoft partnered with Elon Musk SpaceX to connect its Azure cloud computing network to Starlink satellite internet service. So big data is, of course, now relevant to all areas of agriculture, industrial agriculture system, and its information requirement. It connects inputs, seeds, fertilizer, and chemicals to farm equipments and food and beverages processors and retailers to consumers in an unprecedented way. And in this process, data has become a major driver of consolidation. This integration are getting more and more strengthened through corporate partnerships, mergers, and takeovers, creating the possibilities for a much more profound and complete control capture of food system. Next slide, please. So here the question arises, and it's one of the most important questions: who owns or controls the agriculture data generated through these digitalization by big tech and agribusiness corporations? In fact, when India signed the MOU with big tech companies like Microsoft, it's not one MOU. India signed several MOUs with several companies. And some of the big tech are like Microsoft, Amazon, Cisco, And some of these Indian companies like Jio and Patanjali and all. And one of the activist group in India called ASHA, which is an Alliance for Sustainable and Holistic Agriculture, they raised this issue of privacy and data ownership. And in a letter to the PM, they said that this new development is taking place in a policy vacuum with respect to data privacy of farmers and their related issues. And just to inform you, till today, India does not have a law regarding control and ownership of digital data. And I think Parminder, I mean, he's an expert in this area because he's one of the experts who is working on developing a law on the ownership of digital data. So therefore, it's very important to know where the data is getting stored, who owns it, and who has control over it. In a December 2018 speech, one of India's multinational company CEO, which is Reliance CEO Mukesh Ambani, he demanded that Indian government prevent corporates, especially global corporations, from owning Indian data. He said, data colonialism is as bad as previous forms of colonization. Data freedom is as precious as freedom we won in 1947. But strangely, within few months of giving this statement, Reliance sold almost 10% of its digital business to Facebook. And probably through this, they compromised a huge database of Indian consumers, and because they have also a big network of JioMart and Reliance Jio. And we really don't know whether the data which was supplied to Facebook are now stored in USA or in India. It is not surprising that corporations involved in digital agriculture approach this issue of data privacy as a profit-making possibility. For example, when farmers buy equipments like tractors from John Deere, they must sign up for certain conditions with respect to data that John Deere will gather from the tractor. Farmers sign up a license to operate the vehicle, but they are not the owner of the equipment, the software embedded in it, or the data generated by the equipment. In addition, farmers are sometimes forbidden from repairing their own equipment, their own tractors which they have bought. Companies like Dairy say it is illegal for farmers or independent technicians to tinker with embedded software, which is considered proprietary. This raises a number of concerns about losing control and ownership over both data and the tools used in farming. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. This type of conditions are also evident in the partnership between the big agrochemical and seed companies and farm equipment manufacturers. These collaborations involve the sale of or exchange of data, which are analyzed to deliver prescriptions to the farmer. For example, which seeds to plant on which plot of land or the application rates of other inputs. The company that controls farm data is positioned to use its farm management platform to link the farmer to preferred products, for example, its own or for those of its partners. However, we are confident that the big data attempts to take over food system will not go unchallenged. And we have witnessed a big challenge to this monopolization of data or digital agriculture system by farmers in India. In 2021, India witnessed a massive mobilization of farmers across the country, and the capital city of Delhi witnessed one of the largest and longest farmer protests in the history of modern India. Apparently, the farmers were opposed to the 3 farm legislation brought out by the government, which they believed are meant to benefit Indian agribusiness, but they were also opposing the increasing monopoly by big tech and agribusiness over the food and agriculture. Because some of the provisions of the 3 legislation, which all of 3 were later withdrawn after, maybe 378 days of the protest. These legislation tried to accelerate agriculture, agri-tech and agribusiness monopoly through setting up electronic trading platforms, comprehensive and dynamic farmer database, and promotion of digital and smart farming initiative. Though through this withdrawal of these three bills, India or Indian farmers could, manage to get a victory, but it is not the final. We have not won the final battle, and I think there is a need for the farmers of the world to wage a war against this monopoly of data across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Afsar, for that very comprehensive discussion. I think it's important to situate Afsar's discussion in light of the food crisis now and how these big companies, both big tech and big food, are trying to push responses, corporate responses to the food crisis. That a lot of it are techno fixes, right? They push for, well, in the name of innovation, they're pushing for the use of these technologies. And as Afsar said, what's really alarming is that this marriage of big tech and big agribusiness and how they control data and how they monopolize agriculture and how this control of data is driving further consolidation of the big industries in the food system in general. So thanks for that, Afsar. We now move from agriculture. Let's now move to the energy sector. Our next speaker is Sofia Scassera. Sofia is an associate researcher at the Transnational Institute. She is a lecturer and researcher at the National University 3 de Febrero in Argentina, where she runs an observatory of social impacts of AI. She's a member of the A+ Alliance for Inclusive Algorithms. Sofia will explain the data and energy issues for us. Sofia, you have 15 minutes.
Hello, thank you very much, Joseph. Thanks for the invitation. I will try to, I'm not an expert on energy, but I will try to set the relationship between data and energy. And I found that there's two types of relationship that we can address. One is the energy consumption of the data centers, and the other one is the energy production that is data driven. So the first thing that we need to understand here is how energy production in the global south is done, especially through colonialism, in the appropriation of raw materials. We know that a lot of countries are being forced to go to the energy transition, privatizing the energy sector in their own countries. And free trade agreements are pushing this type of agendas. Because, like in the WTO, they are talking a lot about the environment agenda and how important is the environment in the WTO. And therefore, they're trying to set environmental standards on how products are being produced and how the energy in those countries are being produced. And many countries, we have seen this in the WTO, are really raising concerns about how they're being pushed for a quick energy transition, forcing them to privatize all their energy sectors, and therefore having a massive appropriation of raw materials in their own country. Some concerns are being raised, especially from countries that have the capacity, the industrial capacity to build their own energy sector strategies. For example, like in Argentina or in Brazil, in Latin America or in Chile, we have seen countries that they have the capacity to build their own green energy infrastructure, but they're being forced to have a quick energy transition in order to have an appropriation of their energy sector. And we know that energy sector is also about sovereignty, and it's a strategic sector. Also, there's other instruments in free trade agreements like the Energy Charter Treaty, that is a dangerous investment agreement that allows fossil fuel industry to keep hold of resources and continue harming the planet. So we have seen these already in many free trade agreements. The truth is that now we have seen that there's like a triangle, we can say, of free trade agreements. We have the e-commerce agreement that tries to appropriate the data, and we have other raw materials free trade agreements that are trying to extract the lithium and other resources in global South countries. So we can see how the digital transition in the world is being done by total colonialism from the north to the global south, appropriating the data and appropriating the raw materials that can push and can boost the energy in the world. So we have to really think about how these agreements tend to force countries into a colonialist agenda that will extract the materials and that will impose energy models in countries that maybe they're not sustainable enough, and they lose sovereignty and they lose the capacity to build their own energy sector strategy. And we know that energy is, again, strategic, and it's a sovereignty issue, and also that there's some technologies that can be developed within global South countries that are more sustainable and that have ancient and really traditional ways of producing energies, and with an inclusive point of view, trying for communities to access to the energy in a different way that transnational companies do not take into account. So what I see is that this is on the energy production side, and the energy production is not only about the appropriation of raw materials, but also when you see how data is being used to produce energy worldwide. We know that the energy sector is a information-driven sector. The demand is already set, because the demand is what the population and the industries demand of energy. And generally, the energy sector tends to do their own decisions, take their own decisions based on data and based on information. And this is really important to understand, because as Parminder said, we have seen an appropriation of the intelligence and of the information as the asset of big tech companies, and how they are appropriating all the information from many sectors. And the energy sector, when we see how the energy is being produced worldwide, we see that it's every day more and more data-driven. Which decisions are driven by the data, in the energy sector? Well, first of all, the forecast of energy prices. This has been around for several years already, but we have seen that little by little, more decisions are being taken by data, like streamlined refinery and distribution process, efficiency, monitoring energy consumption, the increased oversight and ability to perform predictive maintenance, and they ensure safe outcomes, and the data-driven supply chain management. So we see that there's a lot of decisions around the energy sector that little by little are being taken more and more by data, and by data, not by data, but information that is taken out of data. And the data is being colonialized, it's being kept by a handful of companies, by a couple of companies. So we have to think that little by little, if the monopolization of this information is being done by a couple of companies, to have a just energy transition and to have alternative energy models in the global south will be more difficult, because those models will be more inefficient, and therefore the discourse of no, let us multinational companies take care of your own energy sector will be more and more approved in the international community. And this is really dangerous. This is a really big hazard that we cannot take the risk of having, because we have seen this type of colonization over and over in many, many sectors, and the energy sector will not be will not face a different situation, losing sovereignty and losing other types of capacities in we can say technological capacities in the global south. I want to quote an example of how dangerous it is in the sovereignty, in how they lose sovereignty in global south countries. That it's an example that that happened in Latin America many years ago when Hugo Chavez was the president of Venezuela. He had PDVSA, that it's the company that produces gas and petrol in Venezuela, but the telecom sector of the PDVSA was outsourced by USA companies. And when Chavez started fighting with George Bush, that was at the moment the president of the United States, they shut down the telecommunication systems of PDVSA for many weeks, and Venezuela could not sell in the international markets gas and oil in order to provide to the Venezuelan state resources, we can say dollars, in order to drive the economy and all the social programs that they were doing at the moment. So this happened in the telecommunications sector. Imagine what could happen with the information technology and with the data-driven energy sector once it is more and more driven by data, and the more efficient decisions are being taken by data-driven economy. So this is a really big problem that they are facing in the energy production sector. Now, this is not the only relationship that we can see between data and energy. There's also the relationship between data centers and how much energy it's being consumed by having data centers in the world. First, we need to know that not all data is being used. We store humongous amount of useless data in the world. And this is a really important issue because many of the big tech companies do not even know where the data exactly is and how much data is really being used. So, and this has been said by them, by the CEOs of the big tech companies many times. We can see declarations over and over again of them not really knowing where the data is stored and how much data is being used, and that they don't erase the data, and data is being accumulated worldwide in different data centers. But the data centers consume energy, consume a lot of energy, and this is becoming a really big problem for the environment worldwide. Data centers need some environmental standards and conditions to create ideal conditions for their operations. For example, heat and humidity could be a threat to the continuous operation of servers. In addition, continuous access to power and water are essential for their operation. This fact has had major consequences in some countries, such as Singapore or Ireland, where the power consumption of data centers is increasingly high, putting a risk to the energy supply of the population. In the case of Singapore, for example, a key country for technological development in Asia Pacific, this country has established a moratorium from 2019 that suspends installation of new data centers in the country due to the strain they put on the electric grid and the increasing carbon emissions. To date, there are several projects in Singapore that seek to incorporate renewable energies and make better use of resources and maintenance of data centers, with the aim of lifting the moratorium soon. The truth is that data centers maintenance consume two fundamental resources: energy to keep them running and water to cool them. Like the cooling systems in large office buildings, water evaporates in data centers' cooling towers, leaving salty wastewater known as blowdown that must be treated in local utilities. Needs are increasing as climate change exacerbates drought. Indeed, approximately 20% of the US data centers relied on drought-affected watershed. The storage industry reliance on water is putting the digital business at risk, and they know about this. So that's why big tech companies are doing a huge propaganda about green energy and what the importance of green energy and a quick transition to green energy. And they're pushing countries in the global south also to have this transition quick, because they know that if they don't start consuming green energy for their data centers, the whole data and digital business could collapse, could be at risk. In the Netherlands, for example, Netherlands is a huge data center because it has the exchange points of information that enter to Europe inside the Netherlands, inside Amsterdam. And the large amount of energy consumed by the storage industry has made companies concerned about using green energy so as not to be challenged with ethical, ecological aspect. Today, 86% of the data centers in the Netherlands are supported by renewable energy, which generates a trade-off between electricity consumption to support households and industrial consumption and the energy consumed by these data centers. In fact, in the Netherlands, 11.1% of its energy is from the renewable resources. And of that percentage, almost 2% is consumed by data centers. So that means that a total of 20 of the renewable energy produced by the Netherlands is consumed by the data. About data as a resource. We see that this energy that we are to support households, to support families, to support industries, and therefore is not going to a redistribution logic worldwide to support the benefit for all, but the benefit of a few companies that drive the data centers worldwide and have the capacity to monopolize the data in the world. So I will cut here. Thank you very much for listening. And this is what my reflections about energy and data and how data is being is consuming energy worldwide and how data could boost energy production in a colonialized point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sofia, for that discussion. Very clear, the relationships that you discussed. From Afsar's discussion on agriculture and Sofia's on energy, very clearly, we're seeing the dangers, really, the dangers of this monopolization of data even in just those two aspects, no? And as Sofia already mentioned this, no, that one instrument of this data monopolization are the free trade agreements and the various agreements, right? That countries are sometimes forced into, sometimes willingly enter into. Our next speaker, who will be presenting us a video, is Professor Jane Kelsey. Jane is an activist academic who specializes in international economic law. She's Professor Emeritus at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. She will make her presentation on the digital trade negotiations and the need to have digital regulation outside the WTO and trade agreements. So if I may ask Rafni to play Professor Kelsey's video recording, please.
Kia ora. Greetings to you from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm sorry I can't be part of the webinar live, but it's a bit late in this part of the world. I've been asked to share some thoughts with you around the role of the big tech companies in the current push for digital trade e-commerce rules that are occurring in a variety of trade negotiations, excuse me, but also that are being pushed in the context of the G20. The starting point is to recognize that digital trade is not actually about trade as we traditionally understand it. It's about making commitments not to regulate the digital space. Whether we're talking about digital technologies, data, servers, marketplaces, search engines, platforms, social media, even payment systems. Obviously, that's what big tech and its lobbyists want in their ideal world. And US governments have been collaborating with them to make that a reality in the guise of trade rules. The origin of this hands-off approach to the internet is US legislation, the US Telecommunications Act 1996, which set out to regulate telecoms, but said we shall not regulate the internet. And so for the past 20 years, at the urging of the big tech companies, the US has been exporting this model to the rest of the world to benefit the incumbents, the big tech companies that already were dominant or first movers in the digital domain, and lock in their dominance to ensure that other countries and other companies weren't going to effectively compete. This was a carefully devised strategy. It started in earnest with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement negotiations in 2010 and is still unfolding today at the G20 and in other arenas such as the World Trade Organization and the newly announced US-led Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So why opt for trade rules? Well, the tech companies were worried that the obvious place for developing global rules to deal with the digital domain was the International Telecommunications Union. It didn't like that because that was a place in which there was a semblance of balance in terms of the interests and issues that were on the table, presence of multi-stakeholder participants, and they took place in public. Trade rules, by contrast, are pro-corporate, are binding and enforceable, and negotiated in secret. So what was this wish list that was going to allow them to rule the digital world? Well, top of the list was the right to control data, because data, as we know, is the fuel for the digital economy and the digital domain, and who controls data essentially can dominate that digital domain. And so they wanted absolute rights to control the data generated in their business, take it wherever in the world they wanted to, not require it to be held locally inside the country that was its source, even a copy of it, and not to have to use local computing facilities such as local servers. That, of course, allowed them to take advantage of their economies of scale, but also to locate themselves in jurisdictions that had minimal regulation and to effectively evade regulations and its enforcement in the source countries of the data. They also wanted to protect their source codes and algorithms, the kind of brain that that operates the digital ecosystem. They wanted to protect them from disclosure, not just to their competitors, but to regulators, which makes it extremely difficult, not just for tax and competition regulators, but for looking at how algorithms might, for example, breach labor laws, may breach discrimination laws, may breach fundamental democratic processes by abuses of the ability to target particular information to particular users. They also wanted to be able to operate from their home base without being required to have a presence in the countries in which they operated. That meant not only rules about not having a local presence, but if they did have a local presence in the country, not being required to have a presence of a legal form that could subject them to effective liability. They wanted, of course, to be able to take their people with them wherever they decided to operate and not to have to employ locals, especially in positions where they might learn proprietary knowledge, which of course is an essential development tool for many developing countries who are wanting to create their own capacity. They wanted to ensure there were no rules on requirements for technology transfer, no requirements to use locally produced content, including locally produced software. So again, early starter companies wouldn't be able to have a guaranteed market into the tech companies that were operating in their country. They wanted these rules to apply to financial services as well. And they wanted rules such as no limits on the royalties they might pay to their partner firms, often located in tax havens, as a means of avoiding tax. So that wish list, that digital 24, is what is in the TPPA, and largely, and has been mirrored in many other free trade agreements. And now a number of countries are trying to negotiate them in a breakaway group in the World Trade Organization, but they are also fundamental to Pillar 1 of the US-driven Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Leaked text showed us this is also what they tried to do in TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement, where the tech lobbyists made up almost half of what was known as Team TISA, the corporate lobby that was pushing for TISA. So you might think of this model that's being promoted as a model of corporate sovereignty. The key players, in addition to the US, Japan, Singapore, Australia, are all there in the G20 and are there in IPEF. The EU, which is of course also a major part of the G20, supports the same basic model, subject to individual sovereignty over data. So long as individual privacy in relation to data is okay, the rest of the impacts have largely been ignored by the EU. So the G20 was seized on as an important place to try to advance this model. And in 2019, when Japan was hosting the G20, they had a side meeting that produced what was called the Osaka Declaration about data flows with trust. But of course, data flows with trust isn't about the digital corporations being trustworthy. It was about digital consumers and sellers having confidence in the transactions that were being conducted online. Now, that sounds like a quite big, successful strategy led by the big tech corporations and facilitated by the US and others. But it has not been plain sailing. There has been an increasing backlash against the power of big tech as regulators have come to understand it more and to realize that these rules sign away their regulatory sovereignty. And just as they start to try to catch up, new technologies are emerging that are governed by these rules that they have no ability to be able to regulate if they have signed these agreements. It was interesting that some countries that are also important players in the G20, developing countries, did not support the G20 Osaka agenda. India, Indonesia, South Africa, and Egypt didn't participate in that process. Several of those countries, including others within the ASEAN region, also resisted those rules in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. The digital trade chapter there doesn't have the rule on source code or local content rules. It does have rules on data transfer or rules on what are called data localization, but they can be overridden in a self-judging way for national security reasons. And the chapter is not enforceable. And so we're seeing resistance to these rules, especially from developing countries. We've also seen new rules being developed to try to deal with the fact that big tech are notorious tax evaders. And I'm sure that many of you know the figures, but in the UK, for example, Last year, Apple's retail division earned nearly £1,000 million and paid less than £1 million in tax. In the US, Amazon reported record profits, thanks in part to COVID, profits 75% higher than its previous record haul in 2020, more than $35 billion, and paid just 6% of those profits in the US in corporate taxes. Now, if we think about the impact of this for developing countries, you know, the US is the home country of Amazon. If Amazon has no presence in the developing countries whose data it's mining and where it is now an increasingly dominant retail player, advertiser, travel agency, etc., the tax impacts for those countries are really significant. And the digital tax rules that have prevailed have been that those companies are taxed where they're domiciled. However, countries like Indonesia, India, Vietnam, France, and others introduced what are known as digital services taxes to try to tax the digital revenue, especially in areas like advertising, that these companies have earned from their business in these countries. The US Trade Representative, supported by the big tech lobby, brought investigations against 12 countries that had adopted these digital services taxes under what's known as Section 301 of the Tax Act, of the Trade Act. And not surprisingly, the US found that these taxes were discriminatory against the success of their tech companies and an unfair trade practice, and led to imposing retaliatory sanctions for countries that had adopted them. Since then, there have been an agreement in the OECD to suspend these taxes pending a very US-friendly alternative, which the US is probably not even going to adopt. Now, I've been focusing here on the US and the EU and its supporters, such as Singapore and Australia and Japan, who are promoting this in the WTO. But China also has its own model, and it supports some of these rules, but not all of them. But China, too, has now started to regulate more intrusively the commercial activities of some of its big players like Alibaba, Alipay, Tencent, Didi, and Baidu. Even the US is now looking to regulate and reduce the power of big tech, as is the EU, and subject them to more scrutiny. But in a bizarre way, they're doing this in their domestic domain, but the governments are still peddling the same rules in the international arena. Why is that? Well, you just need to look at the influence of the big tech lobby and the revolving door from the lobby into the trade negotiating arena. In the EU, for example, big tech in the form of Apple, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Huawei, Qualcomm are even now edging out the big energy companies as having the biggest lobbying budgets in the EU. In the US, Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Meta, and their trade group spent almost $95 million in lobbying since 2021, roughly 3 times what they spent 10 years ago, to try to stop the US adopting domestic rules that would regulate them, and in pushing for these rules on a global scale. Over 70% of lobbyists for Google and Meta have formerly worked for government bodies in the EU and member state level. And that's just the EU side. So this debate is happening at a time when those major players in the G20 are still trying to push the digital trade rules. But there are signs, and I've mentioned some of them, that tensions are at work here. And indeed, the G20 meeting in Bali this year was not able to produce an agreed ministerial statement. There was just a chair's summary that was read out to the participating countries, and that Indonesia in the chair claimed reflected some consensus. But Indonesia itself has not been supporting the Osaka agenda of free trade with data flows with trust. So as we look at many of these G20 countries also being a part of IPEF and being a part of the plurilateral processes in the WTO, it's really important to maintain the pressure to ensure that these divisions remain and intensify. We know that in IPEF, digital is a key part of the US agenda in Pillar 1, and the corporate lobbyists will be putting massive resources into ensuring that happens, including through their regional and national lobbyists. So it's vital to have strong public scrutiny and voices challenging the power of big tech, and ensuring that governments who talk the talk of digital development and empowerment, of closing the digital divide, of support for SMEs, of tax justice, know that they can't deliver that agenda and sign up to these digital trade rules. So I hope that has contributed to your webinar today, and I'm sorry that we can't have some discussion about it, but I wish you all well for the remaining deliberations.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that video. We now proceed to the open forum. So we have already 2 questions in the chat box. I wonder if JC from Ebon would like to articulate his question, or should I just read it? JC, are you there? Hello?
I think you can only read it, the questions, Joseph.
Oh, okay. So this is a webinar type. So I'll read the question of JC Navera. JC is a policy officer on trade and investment from Ebon International. He asks, with the Philippines not having our own data centers and therefore have to rely on big tech, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and with all the attendant logistical requirements that Sofia mentioned, how do we advocate for robust digital industrial policy and public data infrastructure in countries with a similar situation? So I suppose all of our speakers can address that, but I think particularly Parminder mentioned this as in the what needs to be done, no? This push for digital industrial policy. So do you want to, who wants to take a crack at answering JC's question?
Sure, Joseph. Thanks, JC, for the question. And Olis's question is also related to this question. And I think it's very important to understand. I'll take 2 minutes and combine the 2 questions to understand how digital industrialization takes place. Digital, unlike industrial technology, is a very different set of technologies. In the industrial technologies, generally something would get invented in a lab, then it is brought to, tested out, and then it's industrialized and then socialized. The digital technologies are very different. They can grow from a single room, and you have seen these startups with just 2-3 computers start networking the restaurants in an area, just 2 or 3 young kids with technology or management things. and within 3 years can grow up into a platform for food delivery. So I'm not therefore minimizing some technical challenges, but it's a very different kind of, it's a very social technology of a different kind which grows with people. And countries like Philippines, for example, I know have enough IT competence. India has a huge amount of IT competence, and you should see the difference and tell you, 15 years back, India's IT competence was much more than China's. Nobody thought of China as a software country. It was an industrial country, and India was already near the top in terms of basic IT skills. In 15 years, China has much higher AI, which is close to the AI of US, and some people saying almost beating it, but India has very little AI. So what has happened is, because China created those conditions, which were political, social, political conditions maybe, but we can have it through economic policies also, whereby the homegrown companies could grow. So it is, and digital skills, etc., are learned in India, I have seen, not by teaching people digital skills, but since the transportation companies also went to the tuk-tuks, the tuk-tuk guys have become digital literate because there is an Uber of tuk-tuk already, and then they can work things. So data centers is not that big a technology. Once you own your own platforms, these ancillary industries grow. Meanwhile, you can always use a country which is ready to respect your own law and park your data there. Data can be parked outside, and you can still be in control of your data and slowly develop your own data infrastructures, and regional hubs can be developed. So all these possibilities are there for digital industrial, and we shouldn't be looking at, we are missing this, how to do it. I think the biggest thing is to have your infant platform companies and allow them space to grow. Sorry for the long response.
Thanks for that response, Parminder. Any other, Sofia or Afsar, do you want to respond to the question as well? I'm just looking at the chat box there. Are there any other questions from the participants in the chat box?
The questions from Elysius.
Yeah, they were partly addressed already but let me just read it also. Parminder tried to address the two questions together. Alicia said that there seems to be a lag of digital infrastructure become a way for big tech to take their dominance, especially in the investment scheme, as many countries just copy GDPR, General Data Protection, right? Regulation as their local regulation. Is it enough to protect countries or people there? What's the most important thing to regulate first? So all of the speakers mentioned to a certain degree the need for greater regulation. Maybe I just want to ask all our speakers, maybe starting with Afsar and Sofia, on the particular sectors, agri-sector and the energy sector, what type of regulation do you think would be necessary to control this drive towards monopolization of agriculture and energy? Oh, sorry. Sofia has left the room. Maybe Afsar can answer my question.
Hi, Joseph. Yeah, I think I didn't touch upon much on the regulation part, but of course we need certain kind of regulation to for basically for the big tech companies as in the agriculture sector. And right now we are not seeing any kind of regulation or any kind of how to regulate these big tech companies. And that is the reason we are seeing the impact of this unregulated, there's no monitoring, nothing. And it's happening at a very fast scale, the way the small farmers are being impacted by this non-regulation of this technology. And if you look at in country like India, I mean, there are in the law which was brought out by the government in 2020, the 3 farm laws, and after that the government of India withdrew all the 3, but they were implemented at the state level. Almost more than 7-8 states have already implemented that, and the farmers in those states where these laws have been implemented are really facing the problem, because the traders are, they buy the products from these farmers, but there is no payment. I mean, in most of these states, we are seeing that the farmers are not getting their due payments. So, and most of this trading is happening online. So there need to be some kind of regulation by the government of India, as well as, and as well as, I don't know, some of the activist groups or farmers groups should come forward to demand that, because unless we have a demand for this strict regulation of digital companies or big tech companies who are through whose platform all these apps are being all these apps are running, most of these apps, because India, I mean, just to give you an example, we have currently in India more than 2,000 startups in agriculture sector, and nobody knows how those startups are being monitored. There is no supervision, there is no control, nothing. So there need to be certain, and I hope Parminder will also put some light on this issue, because there need to be some kind of a regulation of this startup, because it is nobody else but the small farmers are really facing the problem, and they are being impacted by this.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Did we lose Joseph, Rashmi?
Yeah, I think we lost him. I don't know why. Okay. While we are waiting for Joseph, I
So
think
Rami,
we can.
can I take it then?
Yeah. Do you want to continue or to respond?
So going from Afsar, I think Joseph asked what kind of data infrastructure, data regulation in energy or agriculture should take place. So some of these issues are horizontal and some are sector related. Horizontally, but also in these 2 sectors, one of the most important thing to do is to develop data rights. The data rights should be individual as well as collective. And I've just finished data primer for data and economic justice for global partnership for AI, which I'll share, in which we have given a formula of 4 kinds of data rights. Right to benefit from one's data and avoid harm. Right to access one's data and port one's data. Port means give it to a third party of choice. Third is data, right to be represented appropriately in data, including absence from data. And fourth is right to govern data and right to govern database systems. Based on this kind of rights, like Indian committee has given, data infrastructures are developed where all collectors of data are mandated to give their share their data into a data infrastructure, and that then can be used by NGOs, local startups, and there is a more competitive system. Coming to what Afsar was saying, the Indian situation in agriculture especially is a very regulated sector, and we are saying that there should not be end-to-end private platforms, and public sector should own the heart of the platform, but it should be based on a law, not ad hoc ownership. So by law, the heart of the platform should be with the public sector, and that should allow different startups and businesses to go through that. And the only way to approach the farmer has to be through that system. And therefore, as Afsar is saying, that there are 2,000 agri-techs. If they only can go through one system to a farmer, which is become a system of regulation and controlled by public authority, that is one way to do it. And in the same system, then data infrastructures can also be built. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Parminder. I think Joseph is back. Joseph, we lost you for a while.
Yeah, sorry, I got disconnected. I don't know if there
Yeah.
are more questions, but it's good. Stay there, Rakmi. Stay there
Yeah.
and co-moderate this open
Yeah.
forum with me.
Well, I think so far we don't have any questions after Parminder and Afsar answered. I don't know, Joseph, perhaps if no more questions, I think what we can do next after this webinar, I think we can try to discuss that more.
Yeah, so should we go back to the speakers then maybe and get their ideas on, because this is just Rakmi and TNI. This webinar is really intended to, as Parminder said, no, one of the basic problems is that very little information is known about this whole ecosystem. So we need to unpack it can be a bit complicated and complex, but we need more discussions like this. So that's why that was the intention of the webinar. But what aside from organizing, maybe we can go to specifically to IT for Change and GRAI. Now, what are you doing to further educate, movements and maybe perhaps even governments, no, on this whole ecosystem and the need for greater regulation. So maybe we can start with that as we segue into the last part of our discussion on what's next and what next steps.
Yeah, as you rightly pointed out, Joseph, I mean, we need to educate, I'm talking about the agriculture sector, we need to educate the farmers groups and the farmers. And this process is happening. In fact, if you look at, the Indian farmer groups and some of the, I mean, Kanyan very well. He's one of the farmer who is, developing. And yesterday I had a talk with him. He has already, hired a company to develop an app to basically market here, the produce, because he's part of a FPO, the Farmers Producers Organization, and that Farmers Producers Organization is trying to basically, develop an app so that they market their produce and whatever other requirements are for example, climatic requirement. I mean, just to look at what would happen tomorrow, whether it will rain or not rain. Sometimes the farmers lose their crop because it rains and they had no idea about the forecast. So all these details, what a private company provide, and we really don't know what is the motive of that company, whether they want to get into selling of the products. It normally happens because these big agri-tech companies, they buy these small startups and then start promoting their own products. But when the technology goes into the hands of the farmers, that is very important, and because they would never let it go to a company. And that's what I was discussing with Kanyan yesterday, because I asked him a very straightforward question. What would happen if a company will approach you and you have, for example, 5,000 and 10,000 downloads of this app, or 5,000, 10,000 farmers are using it. Will you sell this to the corporation or a company, for example, Reliance or Adani or whatsoever, Microsoft approach you? He said, no, never. Because this is for basically for the, for that particular community, and they want to take use of it. They will never sell it at whatever, in whatever condition. I mean, so this is very important to educate other farmers groups like what is happening with the Kanyan groups. And this is, I mean, this is the only way the farmers can be protected and they will not get trapped into this agri-tech, controlled digitalization and agriculture.
So it's not just a question of regulation, so Afsar, as you said with Kanayan's example, it's also a matter of farmers asserting their right over data and how to use that data to serve their own purposes, right? Rather than being left in the hands of corporations. So there are two aspects of it. Thanks, Afsar. Parminder, can you tell us more about what IT Change is doing?
Yes, so Afsar is right. And of course, I also know and work with Kanyan. And That's important. But there's also an issue that digital works at scale. It's like intelligence. Intelligence works at scale. I keep on giving an example. In my body, if instead of one brain, there were 10 brains in different parts of my body, regulating different parts of my body, that would not be as efficient as having a single brain. So this intelligence has a simple efficiency when it is centralized. So it need not be centralized, but need to be at scale. So what we need are federated systems which are controlled from the peripheries, but they still are able to share and access other intelligences. Which kind of architectures are being built? Apart from that, and this is first of all requires what Afsar is saying, that people own up their systems, and however, they have to be collective rights given by law over data. Because if you don't have by law rights, if you are only using private law for your rights, that does not work for a weaker party. So public law is needed, which is a rights-based thing. So rights are needed. And once the rights are needed, done, then we can do these things. So two things IT for Change is doing. IT for Change has this global network called JustNet Coalition, which we are holding the secretariat of, and many of you know about it. Focus is a member. So we call it JustNet 2.0, whereby we are working with different sectoral organizations in agriculture with ETC, somewhat with grain also. And in each sector, we have a digital hub and that sector, and together try to develop a digital perspectives in this area, because some perspectives are cross-cutting and some are sectoral. While we agree that data today is data in a classroom, data in health, data in agriculture, there's nothing called just data. However, some things are common between all the three kinds of data. We cannot also ignore that. So we are trying to develop this hub and spoke model with sectors, with a horizontal digital thing. And this would, I think, increase our knowledge, including we in the digital sector learn so much. Afsar's slides were so good. And I was typing for some friend that much of the knowledge has today moved into the sectors rather than the digital side. Second thing we are doing in India, we were able to convince the Indian government partly that this is not a technology area, but this is a socio-economic area. So don't try to show, they try to do agri-tech as if it is a technology thing. And then therefore already will call technology experts and tech companies, because they say only they have our expertise. We said, no, it's a farmers and agriculture policy, and therefore call farmers. Now, India has agreed to develop a policy first time. Earlier, they were just doing it as a technology blueprint. And Afsar, we are doing a meeting. Just now we decided on 20th and 21st with farmer groups. And I'm already inviting you, but we're getting the farmers together one day to develop their knowledge, and next day to start developing perspectives on what should the policy look like. So these are some kind of things we are doing. But knowledge building, we all agree, is a major thing, and we should hold these meetings more often.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Parminder. Rakmi, we have about 9 minutes to go in the meeting. Since there are no more questions and we've heard from our speakers, if I may, I don't have the capacity to synthesize what all our speakers have said, but I've noted down a few key elements, no? And I divided it into 3 main areas. One is we've tried to unpack the issues and come up with a better understanding of digital colonization. And under digital colonization, some key points that I got are, well, data as raw materials that are being mined from developing countries and used to produce products in platforms owned and controlled by big tech based in developed countries. As Parminder put forward, this idea of digital colonization is actually intelligence and database dependency. So we had discussions as well on monopoly and highly concentrated power in the hands of big tech and other PNCs in agriculture and energy. And this digital colonization is being advanced through FTAs, through e-commerce agreements that are not actually trade agreements, as Jane pointed out, but agreements actually not to regulate, right? So those are some of the elements of digital colonization that we were able to unpack. The next section is impacts and implications. So a lot has been said about loss of sovereignty and other capacities, and on the other hand, increase in corporate sovereignty. So decisions on what food or energy to produce, how to produce, are now driven by data. And again, the problem with that and the risk and the danger with that is that these are in the hands of corporations. In a situation where regulation is weak and it's the corporations who are in fact trying to set the rules that would perpetuate this monopoly control and power. The good thing is that there's resistance, even from developing countries. And even in developed countries, as Jane pointed out, there are moves towards and consideration of regulations at home, but unfortunately, they're still pushing the agenda of big tech outside. And then finally, this area of what needs to be done, just some key words and concepts: digital sovereignty, data rights, digital industrial policy framework, and other policies for data sharing, for example, data infrastructure as public infrastructure, tax justice. And I end with what Parminder said at the beginning. Now, we need digital third worldism, or a bandung for the digital age, which is, I think, a good way to sort of encapsulate the theme of this of our webinar this afternoon. So that's my attempt at synthesizing it. I give the floor back to Rakmi, but thanks again to Parminder, to Afsar, to Sofia, and to Jane for helping us unpack this somewhat complex and complicated issue of data colonization. Rakmi?
Yeah, thank you very much, Joseph, and to all speakers and all participants. And I think we won't stop only for this webinar, but I think we need to continue our work on the campaign, on the advocacy itself, as Joseph said, that how we can, especially from the developing countries, can work hardly to ensure that our data is protected. So I think that's it for our webinar today. And I would like to say thank you very much for all your participations, and see you again in the next event. So bye-bye. See you.